novels often have many film adaptations throughout the years. With these stories having an impact on many future filmmakers, there ends up being a lot of directors who want to give our favorite stories a try. Oftentimes, when we've grown up with one specific adaptation of one of these stories, we end up favoring it when a new version comes out, and instantly decide that this new one must be terrible in comparison to the one that we remember. But are these older versions actually better, or is that just the nostalgia talking? Today is the first video of a new series in which I am hoping to get to the bottom of that question by comparing these adaptations to the older versions of them and determining whether the older version is better or if it's just nostalgia bait. Today I'm talking about Little Women, and I'm comparing the Little Women from 1994 and 2019. Now, I have seen both of these movies, but it has been quite a while. I saw the 2019 version when it was in theaters, and I probably haven't seen the 1994 version for at least a few years. And honestly, I wanted to like Greta Gerwig's adaptation of Little Women. She's a really good director, and I think she's put out some incredible work. But honestly, I didn't really like it when I watched it. But I also figured, hey, it's been 5 years since the last time I've seen this film, so let's give it another try, and maybe it's not as bad as I remember. Also, to make this comparison fair, obviously you can see I'm going into this with my own personal bias, my own personal nostalgia of the 1994 version of the film. But I want to make sure that this isn't just based on my overall opinion of these movies. Instead, I've decided to break these movies down piece by piece, breaking down the portrayals of different characters, different story aspects and relationships to figure out over a point system which one is best, while also being still based on my opinion. So it's really not unbiased at all, it's just a little bit less biased because I'm not looking at the overall thing, I'm looking at individual aspects of it. As a side note, I will not be talking about accuracy of these adaptations to the novel. I personally believe that when you're adapting a piece of media to a different type of media, you do need to make changes. Instead, I want to look specifically at how each of these movies tells the story and how they get the story across, and if I find it to be effective or ineffective. Because frankly, I believe that film adaptations of classic novels are a great way for people to discover these novels. A lot of times they can be quite intimidating because they're written so long ago, but films can be a great bridge to get people interested in them. And with that little disclaimer out of the way, let's dive right in. First, I want to talk about production, specifically the creative production choices. Sets, costuming, that sort of thing. I can't talk about these movies without talking about the costume design, because the costume design for 2019 was controversial. There are many people who have made videos about how bad the costuming is for the 2019 version, and I will direct you to one of those people's videos. One that I really enjoy is Makara Tour's video on this topic. My focus is not on fashion here, and mine is on how the story is being told, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But I do think it is worth noting that the 2019 version just feels hollow, in my opinion, and I think that does add to the effectiveness of the story. The 1994's version, the entire creative team all sort of looked at photographs and drawings and paintings of this time period to try and figure out what would be best, and this was used to determine things like set design, costuming, and even the lighting that was used. Whereas the 2019 version, the costume designer has said that she was trying to merge this older fashion with more modern preppy looks to make it so that modern people would want to dress like the March Sisters. And so as you can see, there is a very different intention here. With the 1994 version, it's with the sanctity of the story, and with the 2019 version, it seems more so trying to modernize and appeal to modern audiences. It almost feels like sell a product, quite frankly. It's so hard to describe the way that this feels different, but the 2019 version, honestly, to me, just feels like a cold movie, and I will get more into that, trust me. While the 1994 version of this film feels very warm, very welcoming and cozy, and that is really in part to a lot of the creative decisions that were being made, from the sets to the costuming to the lighting, as well as some of the story aspects, which we will get into. So for that reason, I have to give the creative production point to 1994. Let's talk about the March Sisters, starting with Jo. Jo is played in 1994 by Winona Ryder and in 2019 by Saoirse Ronan. In both of these films, Jo is very confident, assertive, and intelligent, but can also be very playful and kind. The difference, I think, is how we see this intelligence and softness of Jo. In the 1994 version, my favorite moment of Jo takes place in the later part of the film when she is at the boarding house in New York. She is sitting with Professor Bear and some of the other men at the boarding house, and she gets into a debate with them over whether women should have the right to vote. One of the men makes the argument that women are morally good, and so they should have the right to vote. And Jo actually contests this, and she said, well, women shouldn't have the vote because they're morally good, because men don't have the vote because they're morally good. Women should have a vote because of the same reasons that men do, because they're Americans. I love this because I'm gonna get a little bit academic on you here, but that is how those types of arguments would be made in that time period. Back in the 1860s, when women were making these arguments for their rights, whether it be their right to vote, their right to education, they weren't just saying, oh, we deserve the same rights as men because we're equal to men. Instead, what these women would do is they would use logical and rhetorical strategies in order to convince men to give them the rights that they wanted. For example, some women would write about the right to education by saying that, well, if you want us to be good mothers, then you need to give us an education so that we can raise good children. And I loved seeing Jo making this argument for women having the right to vote with this historical strategy. It made my little academic heart so happy. In 2019, we don't really have a lot of moments like this with Jo that I find great. And like I said, Jo has the capacity of being intelligent and assertive and confident and kind and playful in both of the films. But in the 1994 version, Jo has this sort of natural softness and kindness that underlays everything that she does, whereas the 2019 Jo feels unnecessarily harsh at times, and honestly at times kind of mean. And it's not just Jo. I don't want people coming at me and saying, oh, you just don't understand complicated female characters. It is almost every character in this movie that feels mean. And not just mean to each other, but the script feels mean to these characters as well. Let me give you an example. In the 2019 version, when Jo asks Professor Bear about his opinion on one of her pieces of literature that she's planning on handing into a magazine, he tells her that he doesn't like it. He doesn't think it's the right style for her. And the way she reacts is to tell him he's not her friend, that he is nothing, he will amount to nothing, and she will be remembered forever, over just him saying something that other people have said to her. This would perhaps make sense if Jo had never received any criticism in her life, if her mother and her family had always said you're the best writer ever, or if she had never received any rejection. But that's not the case. Jo has received rejection. She previously says in this film that she doesn't want her name attached to these stories because she knows her mother would not approve of them. So she already knows that this isn't a style that she should be writing, but suddenly, for some reason, she lashes out at this man, tells him that he's nothing, when she's not reacted like that to anyone else who's given her any sort of feedback. It just feels unnecessarily unkind. And this is a big thing for me with this film, is that for some reason, the 2019 Jo, they seem to have only focused on one aspect of her personality, and that is her desire to not get married. And it seems to have amplified her hatred for the institution of marriage in the first place. In the 1994 version, Jo does not hate marriage. There's a part of the film where the four sisters are talking about wanting to get married in the future. Amy says she wants to get married for money. Jo says she wouldn't marry a man for money, but not because of principle, not because she hates marriage, but because, again, that logical character coming through, she says, what if his business goes under? But in 2019, she's obsessively against marriage to the point that she's cruel to anyone who wants to be married. She tries to talk her sister out of getting married on her wedding day. However, I will say the positive thing that is true about both of these portrayals of Jo is the way that they're using Jo to convey these messages. Ryder's Jo in 1994 has a moment where she talks with Professor Bear about how she feels because she's not perfect, because her family has spent so much time focusing on intelligence and, improving their skills, she feels deeply flawed because she's not completely perfect. And we get to see those anxieties, that struggle that she faces as she wonders if she will ever be good enough, if her work will ever be good enough. Whereas with Ronan's Jo in 2019, we get this beautiful monologue where we get to see Jo, who has now regretting giving up on Laurie's proposal, talking about how she wants women to be seen as more than just wives, but also desires love. And I think that balance is really important, and I think it brings up an interesting conversation. Mind you, it is a much more modern conversation, but it is something that feels interesting and something that feels connected to her character. So for that, I am going to have to give the point to the 1994 version, but because of Ronan's excellent monologue, I am going to have to give her half a point. Let's move on to the oldest March sister, Meg. Portrayed in 1994 by Trini Alvarado and in 2019 by Emma Watson. Now for 1994, there's really not much for me to even talk about. Meg does not get talked about much. She's not on screen much. We don't really see much of who she is. All we know is she's a lot less frivolous than her other sister. She's a lot less outgoing. She's very focused on keeping the image of their family intact. 2019 Meg is built up a lot more than the 1994 version. We see her being a little bit more frivolous. We see her having these desires for a better life, and sometimes that putting her into difficult positions, which is, a little bit different characterization, but it's characterization that we don't get any of in the 1994 version, so I'm willing to let that fly. We also do get to see her marriage to Brooke after they get married, and we get to see sort of the struggle with this. And again, this is another instance of this movie feeling unnecessarily mean. And I don't necessarily mean Meg being unkind, but I mean the film itself being unkind to the characters. Meg and Brooke do not have a perfect marriage, and I guess the lesson here is that Meg comes to love and realize that she loves him, but it does feel like there's this underlying resentment there because he is poor. She doesn't have the things that she necessarily wants. She gives into peer pressure very easily, which is one thing I don't like about this characterization about Meg, is they make her character very weak, which doesn't make sense to me because her family is a fairly pious, generous family, and we see them being poor in this film, so it doesn't make sense that she would be so bad at managing money. But it just feels really mean both to Brooke and to Meg as a character in the way that they are portrayed. However, no matter how I feel about Meg being in 2019's version, we do get more of her, and there is more of an attempt to explore her. So for that reason, I have to give the point to 2019. Now, we get on to the middle sister, Beth, played by Claire Danes in 1994 and Eliza Scanlon in 2019. Now, again, in 1994, this is another character who doesn't get much screen time. All we really know is that she's sort of this quiet sister who plays a piano, and we don't really see much more of her than that. The thing that this movie does that I do have to take some criticism to is that the 1994 version relies on you being someone who has already read the book and knows the characters. It relies on you already being close to Beth so that when you are sad about her death, it's because you've already built up a relationship with her through the novel. Another weird thing that happens is that this movie will oftentimes have things happen without any sort of build-up, and that is especially true for Beth, and we see that with her relationship with Mr. Lawrence, where in this movie, I don't think the two of them ever interact. And yet when she gets sick, Mr. Lawrence sends for his best doctor to come and take care of her. When she gets a little bit better for Christmas, he gifts her his pianoforte. And it's just something that feels so strange because we never see them interact. I don't think we see Mr. Lawrence at any other point in the movie. It seems to be this relationship which we've missed. And that's one of the things that I think the 2019 version does a lot better. Beth is fleshed out a lot more. Her relationship to Mr. Lawrence is fleshed out a lot more, especially considering the way that she comes and plays piano in his house, and he feels that it reminds him of the past, it reminds him of those he's lost. which is a very good connection to Beth being the loss for the March family and that connection to music, once again being connected to loss. We get to see a lot more of who Beth is. We get to see her interact with her sisters more, and we spend a lot more time with her when she gets sick, especially the second time, which means that when she does die, we end up feeling a much deeper connection to her. So for that reason, because there's diving so much more into it, I have to give the point to 2019. Now we get to Amy, who was played in 1994 by Kirsten Dunst at age 12 and Samantha Mathis at age 17, and in 2019 by Florence Pugh for the entire time. I have a lot of thoughts about this. Be prepared for a rant. My biggest issue with Amy in the 2019 version, and a lot of the other issues I have with her character stem from this issue, is the fact that they did not cast a younger actor to play Amy at 12 years old. I want to tell you guys something. Florence Pugh was, I think, 22 or 23 when this movie came out. When this movie came out, Florence Pugh was older than me, playing someone who was much younger than me. I just want you to let that logic sink in for a minute. And the biggest issue with that is that it really messes with the perception of Amy. It actually calls to mind a quote that I found about the 1994 version of this film while doing research for this, where the producer said there's something weird about having one actress playing first a child and then an adult. It just didn't work. Here's why it doesn't work. Number one, it makes it really hard to define timelines. This is a very 2019 issue. 2019 is told through flashbacks, and because there is no change in how the actress looks, it's really hard to determine when this is the past and when this is the present, and really how much time has passed. And as Amy is supposed to be the youngest, it makes it really hard to see her as a different age and see her as having grown. Number two, it makes Amy's character insufferable and cruel. Amy is a brat. I know she is a very divisive character, but here's the thing, she's a kid, so it's okay that she's a brat. She's a 12-year-old girl, she's a youngest sibling. Yeah, she's gonna pick on her sisters, she's gonna be whiny, she's gonna do things to annoy them and mess things up. Look, I was 12 once, I'm a younger sister, I was probably the same. And when it's a child doing those things, you're like, okay, they're kind of annoying, but it's a kid, whatever. But when it is a grown woman acting like that, it makes it so much harder to sympathize with this character. And again, this is an instance of these characters in the 2019 version just being mean. And one scene that really calls to mind for me is the burning of Joe's manuscript and how both films handle this moment. In the 1994 version, with Amy being played by a 12-year-old girl, we don't see her burn the manuscript. All we see is Joe coming in, seeing the manuscript in the fireplace, and then seeing Amy realizing what she's kind of done and kind of being afraid and already showing remorse for what she's done. And the reason that this method is significant is because throwing an entire manuscript in the fire is very instant, and she might have felt regret immediately after throwing it in, but at that point there's nothing she can do, she's already done it. But with the 2019 version, what we see is Amy, played by a 22-year-old woman, searching for the manuscript, finding it, and then burning it page by page. Something that feels very deliberate, something where she could have regrets halfway through and stop. But because she doesn't, it makes it feel a lot more cruel. And she does it with the dramatics and the lighting of a woman burning letters from her cheating lover. And then when Joe comes back, Amy is sitting there still angry and almost smug about what she's done, kind of proud of how she's hurt her sister. And it just feels mean. And to me, that characterization is way off. This is a 12-year-old child, and this is the way that you're portraying this character. It feels so unsympathetic to who this character is. The one thing that I do find redeemable about Florence Pugh's portrayal of Amy is her speech to Laurie about marrying for money. Again, this feels like a very modern take, much like Joe's monologue is, but it is something that is memorable, and I do think that it is something that we don't get to see in the 1994 version. When Laurie calls her out for only marrying Fred Vaughn for his money, she doesn't say anything. She doesn't defend herself. So I think giving her the opportunity to defend herself was a good choice. But I cannot abide by the cruel portrayal and the ridiculousness of having an adult play a 12-year-old. So I have to give the point to the 1994 version. So now we get to the matriarch of the March family, Marmee, played in 1994 by Susan Sarandon and in 2019 by Laura Dern. Again, this is an example of a comparison where I have to say that whereas one that does not have a lot of screen time, but it's surprisingly not the 1994 version in this time. This time, the 2019 version doesn't get much screen time, and when she does, we don't really learn much about her as a person. In the 1994 version, Marmee is amazing. She is a charitable woman, she is a feminist through and through, and she's another example of that historically accurate feminist argument that I was talking about earlier. When she meets Mr. Brooke for the first time, he comments on the girls being so active and rambunctious, and she says, I think that women should have the opportunity to be active, and she makes the argument that this womanly weakness and fainting spells that women are prone to comes from the being forced to stay at home and sit all day. And I love that. I love the taking these things of saying like, well, this is what you believe. We know this is what you believe, so I'm going to use that to spin it in my direction. There are other instances of her doing similar things, and I love Susan Sarandon's Marmee. 2019 Marmee, we don't really get much of her. I think the only thing, the most memorable moment is when she talks to Joe about being angry all the time and not being patient and having to work on that and having to sort of daily intentionally work at being better. And I think that that is a really great moment, but that is really the only memorable moment that we get to see Marmee's personality, so I have to give this point to the 1994. Okay, this is the last character we're gonna dive into, I promise, and then we're gonna get into some other stuff. And that is Laurie, played in 1994 by Christian Bale and in 2019 by Timothée Chalamet. Now, again, this is another example of the 2019 version of a character just seeming meaner. In 1994, Laurie is very protective of the girls. He's very kind to all of them. When Meg ends up getting hurt, he cares for her. When she goes to this ball and ends up dressing up completely differently, he doesn't call her out based on the way she looks. He calls her out for violating her principles, for drinking. And when she's sad afterwards, he sits with her. He tries to cheer her up and make her evening a little bit better. When Beth is a little bit nervous about his friends being over at their house, he's the first one to very quickly let her know that they are safe and that they are not someone that she needs to be nervous about, and instantly knowing to comfort her. And although he is a little bit of a player with Amy as an adult, he's never really cruel to her. He's generally just gentle and playful with an incredible amount of charisma that Christian Bale brings to this part. In 2019, not so much. We never see him interact with Beth. We only ever see him interact with Meg and Joe and Amy. And when he does call Meg out at the party, he's not calling her out on her principles. He basically just tells her, hey, you look terrible and I hate the dress you're wearing. And it just feels cruel. When he calls Amy out for only being with Fred Vaughn for his money, he does it loudly and in front of everyone, publicly humiliating her, which feels so awful. And everything that he does, every delivery that he gives is so dry and flat and just tinged with boredom and apathy that it makes the things he's saying not seem playful, but seem intentionally mean. Riddle me this, is the rejected proposal actually a good scene, or is it just the first time we've seen him show any sort of emotion in his delivery of lines? So again, because the 1994 version is just so much kinder in its portrayal and he just doesn't seem like a jerk, I'm giving the point to 1994. Speaking of Amy and Laurie, let's dive into their relationship. Now this is a divisive couple. Some people like them, some people hate them. So in 1994, I really don't like their relationship. It feels weird to me. And the big reason of that is it starts with him joining her to accompany her to her Aunt March's when Beth gets scarlet fever. And she's 12 at this point, he's in his 20s, well the actor is anyways. She's worried that she will never be kissed before she dies. He promises her that he will kiss her before she dies, which feels weird. We also barely see them together. When they're adults, he calls her out for not loving Fred Vaughn, and she calls him out for not taking anything seriously, his art or his work. And then he leaves to go work for his father, and then he comes back, kiss, boom, they're married. And like, that's really it. But in the 2019 version, as much as I don't like Laurie or Amy's portrayals in this film, I do think we're given a way better look at their romance. We get to see them interact a little bit more. We get to see Amy's obvious crush on him as a child. We see them interact more as adults, having a few more conversations. And so when they get together, it feels a little bit more justified and a little bit more rewarding. The point here goes to 2019. The other big relationship is Joe and Bear. And in the 1994 version, we actually get to see them in chronological order, starting with them meeting with each other and becoming intellectual peers. We see them challenge each other and talk about things like philosophy, German literary movements, social rights. He introduces her to opera, and despite the fact that they have this large age gap, that doesn't really come across. There never feels like there is an age gap or like there is a power disparity there, because there is this mutual respect, this intellectual playfulness that the two of them have with each other. In fact, she respects him and his opinions so much that when she finishes writing her novel, she sends it to him to read, and he in turn gets it published for her. Their romance is very fleshed out. It feels rewarding, and because Joe has never really been against marriage, we see that this is the kind of relationship that she does want. One where her intelligence is just as important as her personality, and the fact that they both respect each other and their ideas and their opinions and their values just makes this a really gorgeous relationship. In 2019, because this is told through flashbacks, we see her knowing Bear before they have actually met for the first time, and I think this is a really big issue. The two of them really barely interact, and when they do, Joe becomes really defensive when he gives feedback and leaves without even warning him. The one thing I do like about their relationship is the fact that Bear spends more time with her family when he comes to visit her in Concord, even playing the piano, kind of showing the way that he can kind of fill in this gap of music that has been left when Beth died. So that is the only real thing I like about that relationship, because clearly there was this mindset of, we need to make sure Joe is fully against marriage because modern women hate marriage, which I think is ridiculous. Obviously, I have to go for the absolutely adorable and very healthy relationship, and for the 1994 version gets the point. Okay, we're out of characters and relationships. Let's dive into the themes and the messaging. So in 1994, this is a film that is super kind and comforting. It is about sisterly relationships, girlhood, womanhood, growing up, and more importantly, it is about the joy of girlhood and female relationships. When Jo leaves for New York, she's feeling sad, already regretting her decision to turn down Laurie's proposal, and she feels this independence and adventure that she's looking for. But when she comes back to Concord after Beth is very ill, she comes to realize that she can be independent and successful while still being with her family and with her sisters. And she realizes that that's what she wants. She wants to be able to support each other. Jo is happy for Meg and Amy when they get married, even though it's not necessarily what she would want at the time. And despite growing up, the girls remain creative. Amy remains doing art and ends up marrying a rich man like she said she would. Jo continues to be able to publish her work, and Meg is able to marry for love. But this movie also explores other topics other than just these close interpersonal family relationships. Because this movie takes place during and immediately after the American Civil War, we do get into some conversations that were being had at the moment, such as segregation. The March family were not always poor, but Mr. March ended up losing his money because he refused to encourage segregation. And we also have this conversation about the exploitation of slaves and child workers when we have this conversation about the Marches not owning anything silk because of the principle of it. And we get to see how these other wealthy families who are still part of the Union are benefiting from racism. Frankly, we don't get to talk about it that much. They could have talked about it more, but it's at least a nice attempt to engage in these conversations that would be happening at that time, because how do you think people got rich back then? This movie includes topics that would have been debated at the time, but also includes topics that feel more modern, like celebrating girlhood, dreams, and sisterhood. Whereas the 2019 version feels a lot more harsh. Amy has given up art as an adult. Joe considers giving up writing. Meg is unhappy as a poor man's wife. And I was trying to figure out why this movie feels so unkind. Then I found this quote describing Greta Gerwig's pitch for the movie, and it was this, quote, "The ambition and the dreams that you have as a girl and how they get stomped out of you as you grow up," unquote. Sorry, but why does a movie about women growing up have to include their dreams being crushed? I understand, being a woman is hard, I get it. Why can't we just have a movie that's joyful and encouraging? And also, who exactly is the one whose dreams are getting crushed? Jo isn't, because her book gets published. Meg isn't, because she doesn't have any dreams other than being a mother and a wife. This movie, for some reason, decides that she wants to be an actress, but that's never really something that she expresses. It's just sort of something that she does with her family for fun. I used to put on little dance performances with my sister growing up, but it was not my dream to become a dancer. Even Amy, who, despite not being the most famous painter in the world, is still painting and ends up marrying a rich man like she wanted. So again, whose dreams are being crushed? Why was your decision to look at a book about these four sisters growing up and the joys of them having each other despite being poor, despite the hardships that they go through, and learning to love each other despite the fact they can get on each other's nerves, and why was your first instinct, yes, their dreams need to be crushed? Doesn't make sense to me. And honestly, it explains why this movie feels so mean, because not only do these characters feel mean to each other, but there feels like there's this disdain from the script to these characters as well. Now, there are some more modern feminist messages in this as well, primarily about marriage, like being married is valid, marrying for money is valid, wanting to be independent but also loved is valid. But honestly, this doesn't feel like anything new. Maybe that's just because the way it's feeling now. I remember everyone going wild over those speeches back when they first came out, so I can't get over the cruelness of the decision to portray these characters in the way that they are, so I have to give the point to 1994, but for the incredibly memorable speeches and the impact that they made, I'm gonna give this point another half point in 2019. Next, let's dive into the format of the story. For 1994, we see this told in a chronological order. It does have some weird pacing where things just happen without any warning, like, oh, suddenly Meg has already given birth to 2 twins. Oh, suddenly Aunt March has died. Oh, suddenly Amy has fallen into a pond. And the use of narration is a little bit much for me, even though it's not throughout the entire film, it feels a little bit unnecessary. But we do at least have the luxury of being able to grow up with the sisters, starting as young and watching them get older and getting to actually live their lives with them. Now, the 2019 version is told in the present day, as Gerwig wanted to focus on the adult versions of the sisters with flashbacks to the past. Without varying fashion silhouettes or different actresses, it's really hard to tell what time is which, especially because everything is mirrored in the present and the past. Also, it makes it have this weird separation where instead of growing with the sisters, it feels like you're getting a secondhand story, which makes it harder to connect with them. And also, it really has an issue with letting you linger on emotional moments. One example of this is when Beth dies. We see her die, and then immediately in the very next shot, we see her in the past decorating for the wedding. And it doesn't feel right to me because I understand maybe the idea was, oh, the memory is living on, but what ends up happening is that you kind of forget that she even died, and you don't even really get to feel sad about it because, like, oh, she's back and we're going to interact with her a bit more now, so forget we even said anything. So for that reason, I have to give the point here to 1994. And we are finally to the final comparison, which is how the movie ends. In the 1994 version, it ends with Jo chasing Bear out into the rain, begging him to stay, and kissing him, and that is the end. In the 2019 version, we do get the moment where she kisses Bear in the rain, but then follows with Jo negotiating for her payment for her novel, watching her novel get created, and we get to see her and her family now working at the school she's created in Aunt March's old home. And honestly, I think I do prefer the 2019 version for this. It decentralizes this romance with Bear, which is only really introduced in the last quarter of the film, and it makes the centralized relationships of the sister over the romances, which I think is the main point of this novel, is the sisterly relationships. It also shows the importance of their dreams and their creative endeavors and how they are still centralized, which is kind of ironic considering the fact this movie is apparently about crushed dreams. But regardless of that, the point here goes to 2019. So with our final tally of points, that means that 1994 got 8 points and 2019 got 5. Of course, if you are a fan of the 2019 version, please don't take from this video that you shouldn't enjoy it. You're totally able to have your own opinions about it. My main intention with this video is to just figure out if the older version is as good as we think it is, or if it's just nostalgia. And I can say with confidence that it's not just nostalgia. The 1994 version of this film is, in my opinion, superior. But even if you don't think it's superior, you have to admit it's good. The 1994 film brings this sense of comfort and warmness. You feel like the sisters are genuinely friends with each other, and you can be friends with them as well. The 2019 version feels more like an occasional attempt to get an Oscar-nominated monologue, and also is very cruel to the characters and has the characters be very cruel to each other. In the 1994 version, there's no sense of their dreams being crushed as adults, or as adults acting like bratty children. It's comforting to be able to see things go well for each other, and I would genuinely describe this movie as just pure joy. Despite that, it's not afraid to make these characters challenging, give them different views on love and marriage, and engaging in political debates. Any praise of the 1994 film Little Women is not just the nostalgia talking. This movie is fantastic, and it stands up today by not watering down the female characters, but also allowing them to be loving and soft. So whether you prefer the 1994 version or the 2019 version, you have to admit, saying that the 1994 version is great is definitely not just the nostalgia talking. Oh, he's so in love with her. Oh my gosh.